It had happened fast. The perp had come out of the hole with a gun in one hand, dragging a woman by the hair with the other. Miller's partner, a 10-year veteran named Carson, had shouted out the warning. The perp had turned, swinging the gun out at arm's length like a stuntman on a video. All through training, the instructor had said that you couldn't know what you'd do until the moment came. Killing another human being was hard. Some people couldn't. The perp's gun came around, the gunman dropped the woman and shouted. It turned out that for Miller at least, it wasn't all that hard. How do you get your drag coefficient measured?
You go see somebody, and there's a few different ways to do it. You can spend a lot of money, and you can go to a wind tunnel, where you will get a very accurate drag coefficient in very unrealistic conditions. Because yes, you can really manipulate the wind in a wind tunnel and find out a whole bunch of different angles. But, your bike is kind of rolling on a pair of metal drums, which is perfectly smooth. And so you don't, it's useful for positioning, but it's not great for drag coefficient. So a lot of people will go out onto the road, and you usually have to do about a 6-kilometer lap in order to get the data that you need. So they're pretty challenging sessions. And what people will do is they'll switch equipment per run and be like, well, how's this helmet? How's this helmet? How are these shoes? How are these gloves? And the idea is to get the lowest, CDA or watts per CDA, the highest watts per CDA that you can get.
Yeah. Well, it does sound like somebody has invented a way to make money off athletes. Yet another way to make money off athletes.
Yep, they sure have. Yeah, and I'm here to tell people there's a time in your career for that, and most of you are not at it.
Athletes, give Chris Bagg your money, and he will save you money. He will tell you who to not give your money to,
and you'll have more fun.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of gnarly math, should we get into James S.A. Corey's first half of Leviathan Wakes?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Nice. Right on. Well,
as I
just kind of, as I just said to y'all, we are reading James S.A. Corey's 2011 novel, Leviathan Wakes. It is the first part in, I don't know at which point it becomes the Expanse series. Eventually a TV show, a very popular TV show gets made of these books called The Expanse, but I don't think the first season comes out until sort of the later teens, 2016, 2017. The series of books in the main storyline is 9 books long. This is book 1.
Wow.
And it is, James S.A. Corey is a pen name of 2 authors, Ty Frank and, I had this, and
Daniel Abraham.
Thank you. Daniel Abraham. So Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham are the 2 authors. You have an interesting little tidbit about one of them, right?
Not really. I think I just know that Ty Frank had been a personal assistant to George R.R. Martin, which makes me suspect he's a Chicago person. But I don't know more than that. I have not really looked these guys up, to be honest. Although I imagine there's a Chicago connection there, but I could be completely wrong about that.
Well, so let's get into our recap. This is a big book. This is, in my edition that I've got, is just a shade under 600 pages. And but the font size is forgiving, as we might say, and it's a brisk read, so it goes by pretty fast. But we open with a prologue, which is important because for the rest of the book we're going to have alternating narrators. But we meet Julie Mao, who has been taken prisoner on a ship. Her ship has been captured in a sort of piratical situation, and she's been imprisoned in a storage locker after she has attempted to fight some of her captors. She manages to stay hydrated and alive over 9 days. She hears some things happening. She hears one of her crewmates get thrown out of an airlock. And then everything goes quiet, and she eventually kicks her way out of the storage locker where she's been for 9 days and discovers that everyone on the ship is dead. And I will kick it back over to you as we shift into our two main characters for...
Dead from something that seems really creepy, too.
Yeah.
There's like sort of flesh and a brownish fluid everywhere. And so we meet our first main character, Captain Jim Holden. He's the executive officer of the ice hauler Canterbury. They're hauling ice. I don't even really remember where, from one asteroid colony to another asteroid colony, when they get a distress call from the Scopuli. And the distress call is, this is the same ship that Julie Mao had been on, but she is not there. They find a transmitter, and we learn very quickly it's a trap. And there's a ship lying in wait to destroy the Canterbury. Jim Holden and a much smaller crew on their I forget, their sort of little runabout survive. And he broadcasts a message saying what's happened, and they found some Martian technology associated with this trap. And he says this in his broadcast, which creates dangerous tensions among Earth and Mars. Essentially, people take it as proof that Mars is attacking the belt. Mm-hmm. So and then,
we should really quickly contextualize that we're a few hundred years from our present day.
Sure.
Mars has been colonized and is attempting to terraform the whole planet. At some point, Mars and Earth's relationship sours so much that Earth declares independence. Mars declares independence from Earth after an almost conflict. And then the belt is basically a huge area of...
It's a frontier. It's a frontier.
It's a frontier, exactly.
There's very little government. There's sort of the governments that exist are sort of provisional, but mostly corporate. There's a loose affiliation of belt communities who are... What's the organization that represents them?
The Outer Planets Alliance, the OPA.
The OPA, right. And they sometimes function like the IRA or Hamas. Sometimes they might function more like the PLO in the sort of more peaceful times as advocates. There's a wide variety of political perspectives within the OPA, so that there are those in the OPA who advocate sort of violent insurrection against Mars and Earth, and others who are more inclined to negotiate. But there's tension between all of these entities. So one of the belt communities is Ceres Station, CERES. Ceres is a planetoid in the asteroid belt, and we meet Detective Miller, who is described as wearing a pork pie hat with a hangdog basset hound face, basically... Philip Marlowe as portrayed by Humphrey Bogart in is it which one is it the Maltese Falcon basically it's Philip Marlowe in space and he is our title. He is a detective. He works for a corporation that is being contracted by like the Ceres Mining Corporation or something like that. It's a little bit but we get the idea that he's a good cop. He's a good detector. He might have detective. He might have low-key PTSD, and he is quietly assigned to locate Julie Mao by her rich parents. And he starts to get the sense that maybe there is some connection between her disappearance and the crisis that has ensued. Also, while we meet Miller, Holden's message comes through, and Ceres and the station are on high alert against rioting and things like that, because they think they might be at war. Imagine sort of a post 9/11 scenario. There's a sense that we have been attacked, and we know who did it. It was Mars.
Yeah, and the belt is really kind of they're definitely like frontier is a perfect way to put it, and almost totally peopled by much lower economic class. They're workers. A lot of their resources are kind of siphoned off and sent to Mars or sent to Earth. There's a real resentment of the inner planets. And so if Mars has destroyed basically a water hauler that is helping the belt stay alive, that's
Mars is thought to have destroyed.
Yeah,
a water hauler.
And so back over to Holden. Holden and his crew are sort of summoned by a Martian, it sounds like not really like an aircraft carrier, but maybe like a battleship. Which aren't really made anymore in our day and age, but it was the really big ship that wasn't an aircraft carrier. And they sort of realize that there's no way that they can outrun the Martians. It makes more sense to just go talk to them. So they do. They are interrogated aboard the Doniger, and the Doniger
to be clear, the Martians deny responsibility for the attack on the Canterbury, and this ship their mission is to investigate what really happened.
And they've known for a while that 6 other ships are sort of heading to intercept them. One great feature of these books is that they do really try to stick as closely as they can to realities of what solar system travel might be, where you can really see from a very long way off if ships are headed in your direction. But nobody knows what these 6 ships are that are heading to intercept the Doniger. Nobody's really too worried about it because it's sort of played off as if 6 torpedo boats decided that they were going to go and attack, like a battleship, where you're like, yeah, okay, they might chip the paint, they might cause us some damage, but there's no way that they can really mess with us. They are incorrect. Those 6 ships turn out to be stealth fighters that are able to handle the Doniger, and Holden and his crew are sort of evacuated from the Doniger. Some Marines help them get off the ship. They're sort of ordered to get Holden and his crew off the ship, and a data cube. That is the other thing that is sort of shepherded off of the Doniger as it is destroyed. Holden, his crew, all of the Marines, of course, perish for plot reasons. And now Holden and the rest of his group have a Martian torpedo boat at their disposal.
So they head to the OPA. There is a man there, a former Earth general named Fred Johnson, I want to say, who offers them refuge. Fred Johnson has a lot of credibility among the belt. He's sort of like a general who showed up there to put down an insurrection, did that, but afterwards kind of switched sides, and basically is now working to promote well-being for people in the belt. So he offers them refuge. They go to Tycho Station. Miller, meanwhile, continues to investigate Julie Mao, despite the fact that people are trying to get him to stop, including an OPA operator. He is starting to suspect there's some kind of broad conspiracy involving her disappearance based on various little bits of evidence. Then, and there are all these little low-level acts of war that are happening now. A Mars vessel might be attacked. A belt colony might be attacked. We're not quite at open war, but it's getting there. So Miller's company pulls out of Eros, and Miller no longer has a job. And so he heads to Eros Station because he's gotten a tip from somebody that Julie Mao may have gone there. And it also turns out that Holden and his crew have gotten a tip that somebody of interest to what they're trying to figure out, which is who blew up the Canterbury, might be there as well. And they take their ship, the Rocinante, to try to find this person. They all meet in the lobby of a hotel where they're all attacked by kind of like a, death squad, goon squad. And so Miller, and this is we're like 300 pages in at this point. Miller and Holden finally meet, and Miller sort of helps Holden and his crew survive that attack.
Mm-hmm. In the reason that they were headed for this particular hotel, at least Holden and his crew, Fred Johnson says that the person who owns the scopuli, whose name is Lionel Polanski, has like set up in this hotel, and basically that's the message. If that happens, that's sort of the distress call back to the OPA. And so that's why he's like, hey, Lionel Polanski doesn't exist. That's clearly a member of the scopuli. That's sort of our message that shit is going down. And it turns out that Lionel Polanski in this case is Julie Mao, who is in the hotel room, dead.
Yeah,
infected by whatever the horrific thing was. Yeah, like there are crystals coming out of her body and tubes, and there's a lot of body horror in this book. So they, Miller thinks that his case is basically closed. But what begins to occur is something starts happening on Arrow Station that has been set off by Julie's reappearance. And whoever is behind this like crazy shenanigan takes whatever has infected Julie and begins infecting the entire station, setting up a scenario where Holden and Miller and the crew have to escape Arrow Station to get to the second half of the book. And I think that's
the last thing that happens is Miller and Holden, they split up. Miller and Holden investigate what's going on, get some clues, head back to the crew, but they had told the crew, don't wait too long for us. And when they go back to where they were supposed to meet the crew aren't there. And so as far as we know, Miller and Holden have been stranded on Arrows. Mm-hmm. They've also both been dosed with radiation. And
like a dose of radiation that will kill them.
They need medical treatment within hours. And the where they were hoping to get it was from the ship. It's not there, which is a wonderful cliffhanger. I moved your question to second or to first because I thought mine would be a follow-up. So do you want to kick us off?
Totally, yeah. So this book is rounding out our relativistic noir series.
Yep.
Ostensibly this could be noir, this could be sci-fi, this could be fantasy, this could be page-turner fiction. But we've talked a lot about what makes noir. And I'm not looking for a black and white, this is noir, this is science fiction, but like if you were to kind of like play with the sliders of genre, how much noir is this? How much sci-fi is this? How much page turner is this? Yeah.
What I'm tempted to say is that it's 100% noir and 100% sci-fi. I think it's a perfect hybrid in that sense of both of them. And as you say, with some body horror and a lot of action, but maybe it's really, if you're going to force me to only use 100%.
No. I want as nuanced an answer as you want to give.
Well, I mean, I would say it's equal. It's very, the setting is very much space opera sci-fi. There are missiles and torpedoes and fusion drives and distress calls and operators and slang and shuttles, and we're kind of not quite going fast enough to get relativistic. It's sublight travel, it's solar system sci-fi. It's really a genre that goes back to like the 30s and 40s, like early Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein are kind of inventing this scenario that we're operating. It's almost as old as the American Western, like only a few decades older. And I would say that Holden is our character who represents the sci-fi plot, even though they're both operating in this world. But he's the one, who's on the ship. Basically, he's a young man who is taking on the mantle of captain of his small crew before he really feels he's ready to do that under difficult circumstances, terrible circumstances. Most of his friends are dead, and he's trying to figure out who killed them and get revenge, and he's also trying to keep his crew of about 4 safe and happy in a hostile environment. But then Miller is a classic noir detective. And I don't think it's an accident that he is described as looking like Humphrey Bogart's Philip Marlowe. I think that's completely intentional. In fact, I'm surprised they didn't give him a P first name. And I think you and I have overlapping definitions of noir. You tend to talk about the protagonist, the detective, with the forces arrayed against him, and I agree. The thing where I've always defined noir is the detective gets in too deep.
Totally.
And it gets personal. And so Miller's quest to figure out what happened to Julie Mao is very much a noir plot. He gets assigned this case, and then he gets pulled off it, but he's stubborn, and he keeps reporting it. And Julie Mao, at one point in the very final chapter we read, there's a sentence that's sort of like all of his hope, all of his sort of reason for living is symbolized and represented by Julie Mao. You know, he's probably 50, he's divorced, it was a rough divorce, he drinks too much, he has passed his prime, we learn, as far as being a good detective. Maybe. That's a little bit unclear. And he absolutely gets in too deep, you know. So when we find him in that last chapter, he's not working for anybody, you know. He's also spent his like savings down, and he's really at the edge of his limit, and that is a noir plot. And there is a mystery. So I see those two genres, but there is also, I mean, a mysterious distress call comes to a freighter in deep space, and on it they find a hideous alien threat. Does that sound familiar?
That sounds like Alien. That sounds.
The book is highly derivative in a way that's perfectly fine, right? Because it's creating something kind of new, but with seasoned ideas, and that's fine. And so I agree. I think it's got really three genres. I think it's space opera with a little bit of that horror sci-fi that we get from Alien. You know, in space, nobody can hear you scream. Combined, which, you know, actually isn't true because you have radios and fake atmospheres and things like. It would only be if you were in vacuum that nobody could hear you scream.
And then like your screaming is largely impertinent.
Right, at that point, right, and you've got about 3 seconds to do it. But there is this definitive body horror quality to it. The deaths are very gruesome, and I have mixed feelings about that, because there's a part of me that one of the things I really like about this book is there's a lot of violence that you might find thrilling, but the authors do a really good job documenting the horror of that kind of warfare violence. You think about, I don't remember the character's name, but the navigator on the Canterbury, Holden can hear her breathe, her last breaths.
Yeah.
And they were lovers, and that's this haunting image. The way that Julie Mao's body is described is just gruesome. The medic, the poor sort of weak link medic who gets his head blown off, and then they're in low grav, and so the blood is hovering above his head like a balloon. There's a lot of that gruesomeness to it, and there's a part of me that feels like, no, they're doing it in a very responsible way because it's all horrific. But I also feel like it's supposed to be a little bit thrilling and fun too. And maybe that's what has me maybe taking it down a peg in terms of its craft. But how do you answer the question?
It's an interesting one, because I hadn't really located the two centers of genre with the two characters, and you're totally right. Like that's 100% what's happening, is that Holden's story is the space opera and Miller's is the noir. And so then
it's also a political thriller too. I mean, that's the other
exactly.
thing.
I mean, it's this other, so then the most, like, you know, where it becomes really interesting to me is at the moment when the storylines cross, and you're like, well, now we have this like sort of wonderful. Do you remember spin art when you were a kid? You know, you would like spin a dial and like drop either sand or paint onto it, and due to the spinning sort of canvas, you would make these swirls, but then you could also drag something across the swirls and making these like strange other shapes, which is what I feel like is what begins to happen in the second half of what we read for today, where the noir and the space opera begin to collide. And that's what I think is really, and we'll kind of come back to this about point of view and structure later. I mean, the reason I picked this book, I think, was that I had a sort of sense of what it is that you were talking about without defining it so clearly. Is that I was like, I've read these books and they really feel noir, but they also really feel like high space adventure.
Yeah.
And I think I like the way that you are defining it, because I was thinking about it as sort of a zero-sum game. As like, okay, there's like some noir, there's some science fiction, there's some body horror, there's some political stuff, there's some page turner, there's some pulp, that it all adds up to 100. And I think I prefer your reading, which is like, no, it's 100% both. It's like, rather than one bucket that is full to the brim, you're defining it as sort of two buckets that maybe get mixed in the second half, to certain destructive effect.
Yeah, I mean, it will be interesting to see where it goes. I mean, I guess yeah, and it is, but yeah, and I go, now that I'm saying that too, it's like Holden's story doesn't really feel like noir. Holden's it is really assuming the mantle, right? It's pulling the sword from the stone.
Yeah, it's an epic. It's a behavior manual for young men.
Right. Whereas I don't know which of the 7 stories The Long Goodbye is, but it's kind of like the old campaigner has one more campaign in him, right? Like there's something of that. And there's also I think all noir stories are also kind of love stories, right? And the character is always damaged and often has a hard shell, but often falls in love with somebody or something. It's not always romantic love. The Long Goodbye, it's not romantic love. It's the love of a friend. Chinatown, it is romantic love. In some cases, it's I'm going to protect a kid, or I'm gonna try to protect somebody from this rough life, and then that gets you in trouble. And for Miller, it's Julie Mao. So I wonder where that takes Miller. I have a reading I'm about to do right about that, but there is a moment. Yes, I actually have 2 readings. There's a moment where. Miller has one partner, Havelock, who is subject to racism because he's an earther. So he eventually leaves. He and Miller part on good terms. Miller's sort of like his only friend. Then he is replaced by another partner who's a woman, who's a belter. And there's a moment where it dawns on Miller that maybe he was never supposed to find Julie Mao at all. I don't have this reading cue, but he says to his new partner, "What would you do if you had a case you didn't want to get solved?" And she says, "I'd give it to a fish. I'd give it to the washed out, burned out, divorced, alcoholic detective who thinks he's a hotshot and isn't nearly as good as he once was." And she says it not unkindly.
Right.
She likes him. But at this moment, he figures out that he's the laughing stock of the department. And I guess what I wondered is, do you feel like that moment was well attenuated and foreshadowed up to that point?
I don't think it's foreshadowed, but we're going to revert to our traditional roles here. I think that was intentional. Okay. Because I really do. What I really love about that passage,
ladies and gentlemen, the defense lawyer approaches.
What I love about that passage is you and Miller don't know what's about to happen, and you begin to realize as Muss, his new partner, Octavia Muss. The names are great.
Yep.
As Octavia Muss tells him what she would do, and he begins to realize that she is talking about him.
Yeah.
And is like, "Oh my God, I am a washed up drunk. I am being given the shit jobs." And I think that it's really well done that we aren't foreshadowed that yet. And I think it's important because in order for noir to work, we do have to have some strong confidence in our detective.
Yeah.
Like if Philip Marlowe is Inspector Clouseau, The Long Goodbye does not work. It's, it doesn't function because we begin to anticipate our detective having trouble. And so I think it was really well done, and I really love that section because we're sort of seeing Miller unravel in real time in the first half of this book, and the fact that that's not foreshadowed or attenuated effectively, I think puts us more in Miller's shoes. And we begin to realize, oh shit, he is washed up. Oh shit, he is kind of in Skid Row.
Yeah.
And then it makes way more sense that he is going to fuck off to Eros to try to chase down Julie Mao and chase down James Holden on what is a very low probability bet. And that's one thing that we do that is foreshadowed really well about Miller, is that despite everything, he's got great intuition.
Not just intuition, he comes up with a system to methodically find James Holden's ship that is brilliant, and it works. I don't, maybe it's intentional, but I found it herky-jerky because Miller is so insightful most of the time. I mean, he reminds me of Theodore Bourdieu. He reminds me of Marlow. Like, he always seems to be able to figure the angles. He sees everything that's happening. And the thing that really, I didn't square "you're the laughing stock who thinks he's hot shit" with the scene where Miller effectively faces down the rioters. When in the moment where he effectively faces down the rioters, basically he gets like 30 of them or 50 to stop. He doesn't kill any. He could have killed more of them. He manages to not kill any. He shoots one guy in the knees, and the rest he just talks out of it. And he does it very confidently and very effectively. And what I saw at that moment was a well-respected senior detective who takes a crisis situation and manages it very adroitly. I can't imagine that guy being the laughingstock of the department, you know? And so maybe if more time had passed, but it's only a couple of months. And also, we do get the sense that he's drinking a little bit too much, but at one point, to buy cover for himself, there's the moment where someone comes into his apartment and he's ashamed of the bottles. And that was like the one clue. But we also know that he's pretending to drink too much in order to convince his bosses that he is not working on the Julie Mao case, which just seems a little bit clever. So I found it jerky. And then also when he very cleverly figures out how to find James Holden, again, that to me wasn't the act of a wash-up detective. And so I don't know, I felt like I didn't quite find the focus there. And I do hear what you're saying, that if it would be pretty brilliant to have it come out of nowhere, but I feel like when things come out of nowhere in a book, they should come out of nowhere, but then they should also make sense. You should suddenly see the pattern that you had only subconsciously saw before. And I don't know, I didn't feel like I saw that. But I do want to do a reading. This probably relates more to your first question than my follow-up question. This is towards the end, chapter 28. Miller has just killed 3 of these goons pretending to be security officers. Now, what they're doing is horrific. And if anybody needs killing, it's these people. They're herding up civilians and basically poisoning them. And he is telling this, he's remembering the first time he killed somebody as a cop. And it was this moment where a man was dragging a woman by the hair and then like pulled a gun on him. It had happened fast. The perp had come out of the hole with a gun in one hand, dragging a woman by the hair with the other. Miller's partner, a 10-year veteran named Carson, had shouted out the warning. The perp had turned, swinging the gun out at arm's length like a stuntman on a video. All through training, the instructor had said that you couldn't know what you'd do until the moment came. Killing another human being was hard. Some people couldn't. The perp's gun came around. The gunman dropped the woman and shouted. It turned out that for Miller, at least, it wasn't all that hard. Afterward, he'd been through mandatory counseling. He'd cried. He'd suffered the nightmares and shakes and all the things that cops suffered quietly and didn't talk about. But even then, it seemed to be happening to him at a distance, like he'd gotten too drunk and was watching himself throw up. It was just a physical reaction. It would pass. The important thing was he knew the answer to the question. Yes, if he needed to, he could take a life. It wasn't until now, walking through the corridor of Eros, that he'd taken joy in it. First of all, great passage, I think.
Great passage. I love Holden Miller's passages because they're usually, the sentences are shorter, punchier, a little more declarative. And there's a section in what you just read where I think it's maybe 4 or 5 sentences in a row that are couldn't be more than 8 or 10 words long. You know, just real. Yeah. And like, that's not something that you would do lightly.
Yep.
Like, you know, 5 to 6 sentences in a row with roughly the same sentence structure, like, can really come across as stringy, repetitive. But I think that's the point here, right? Because we're talking about a moment that he's probably replayed over and over in his head in little flashes and little snippets of memory. Great passage. Really well done.
And also, when have we recently read a passage where a detective finds himself enjoying the killing in a way that horrifies him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Red Harvest,
right?
Blood Simple.
It's the Blood Simple version, which I think is fine, right? Like, I think it's perfectly fine to lift that idea, you know, from a 70-year-old book and drop it into this book, and it fits too.
And also because, I mean, Miller has nothing at this point. Like, he has no job. Yeah. He has sort of been chased from his job that he was at one point good at, but is no longer good at. The divorce was rough. He's drinking too much. He's running out of money.
And
the person that he came to Arrows to find
is
dead.
The edge. Yeah, which is
in a really terrible way, in a very unsettling way.
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, I like Holden as a character. I find Miller's arc to be more interesting at this point.
Yeah,
too. And Holden's arc more and more just starts to feel like a series of cliffhangers to me.
Yeah.
Like, this guy is the worst luck. Like, wherever he goes, somebody tries to blow him up or shoot at him or poison him. And it's starting to get a little monotonous, I thought.
Well, because, and we see this a lot, it's usually his own damn fault. That Holden's tragic flaw is that he is Julian Assange. He is like, information is for everybody. And Miller is like, hey, man, you're very noble. The more that people know about this stuff, the worse the war is going to get. And there's this great passage where Miller sort of talks to Holden that every time you have thought it was one thing, it wasn't. And you blabbed about it and things got worse.
Holden has he has the right impulse. He has poor execution. That's a very good point.
Mm-hmm. Where does in episodes 4, 5, and 6, I'm kind of thinking, our parallels here that Luke is Holden, and Solo is Miller,
and
it's kind of like, at what point does Luke's story become more interesting? And it's not until, I don't know. Yeah. What's your answer to that? I have an answer, but where do you feel like Luke's story truly begins to become more interesting?
It's the third movie. But I also think it's interesting in the first movie too. It's pulling the sword out of the stone, answering the call to adventure. And that is, I do think the great thing about Holden is that we've seen him change from, when he goes, he's gotten this kind of hard-nosed trust but verify. When they go ashore on Eros, they're all armed and they go in their pressure suits. They trust Fred Johnson, but they're ready for trouble. And basically there's this moment where Holden's like, I'm never going to be caught with my pants down. I'm never going to be in a situation where somebody can kill me and my friends again, without a fight. And so I do find that interesting, but then it's not as interesting as Miller. And I agree, like, if we're following the Star Wars thread, he answers the call to adventure. He's got to grow a little bit. And then at some point, if it's that kind of story, he'll grow into his capacity and do something truly heroic.
Yeah.
With a little bit of wisdom.
Right. And that doesn't happen until after the first, basically
it's
the
Empire
end of
Strikes
Empire.
Back. Yeah.
It's like where Luke's story.
He fought his father too soon. paid the price and learned the lesson. And then he appears, 3 years later, a much wiser man.
Yeah.
And fully
I think,
realized.
and Solo story, because Solo, like Miller, is more worldly.
Yep.
Is pretty interesting from the get-go.
Yeah.
Because there's this whole will they or won't they with Leia, and is he actually going to transcend his kind of smuggler background? Spoiler, yes.
Yes.
And I think that it's a similar thing here, is that Holden is the moral center of the book, but Miller is, I think, what most of us would prefer to be in terms of sort of the figuring it out, wily, kind of.
But probably not the depression, PTSD,
no,
and alcoholism.
not the rest of that. But, Holden, he's not Odysseus.
Right.
He doesn't have that level. He is a little bit more. He's a little bit more like Achilles. He's a little more straightforward. Yeah.
But it's also, I do think that they are, they complement each other well, and that maybe between the two of them, you might get an Odysseus,
Yeah, exactly.
And also I think another thing about Holden is that part of his source of strength is his crew too, his team, and those three supporting characters, Omar, Naomi, and Alex are great characters, and
they're done really
very
really
well drawn, very well drawn, and also they're his source of inspiration and strength and motivation. So it is really interesting, because basically both characters now, if they really are stranded, I'm not sure that the Rocinante has left the station. I wouldn't be surprised if they manage to get on the Rocinante after all. Maybe it's about to pull away or something like that. But if they really are abandoned on the station, then both characters will start the second half of the book losing the thing that has motivated them for the entire first half of the book. And that's an interesting place for them to be.
Yeah. So I've got a question about point of view and structure.
Okay.
So up until now, our three noir novels are first-person novels. And they're all, I do this, I do that.
Yep.
And then we shift, not only do we shift away from that, we shift into third-person limited.
Yep.
But we shift into two narrators.
Yep.
We get Holden and Miller. What does this change in, if we are still in noir, and I think we are, I think we've kind of established that, but what does the change in structure and point of view get us?
I think it can make the story bigger. There's something claustrophobic about the first person, and you have to see, the world through Theodore. You have to see the world through Marlow's perspective. Having two characters, suddenly we see this convergence of things. And I think, apart from the character study, what I find the most interesting thing about this story is, and this is I think is very well done, is this sense that some force out there is trying to provoke war between Mars and the Belt for reasons we don't know. We can guess who it might be, and I have a guess, but then the biological weapon figures into that in some strange way. Or is it a biological weapon, or is it an alien disease? I don't quite know. I do feel like there was a lot of really quick exposition in that scene with the radiation and stuff that at some point it was like Holden and Miller quickly figured everything out in about 2 minutes. They're like, well, they must be using the radiation to incubate the biological weapon. And they're like, that was awfully quick. And I'm not sure I buy it.
One throwaway, in Julie's notes, that it feeds on radiation.
Right, exactly. But we don't even know that it's a biological weapon, although there's something about the way Julie described it that made people think that. I think the bigness is the thing that I would take in sort of a broader story and something that's more suitable for an epic. You lose that voice, you lose that wry voice that Marlow has, you lose those one-liners, but maybe you also get a sort of more objective accounting of things. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I think I like what you're saying about the bigness of it. What I really like about it is that, just in terms of a storytelling structure, it's great, right? Because you can cliffhanger one character, and then your audience has to have that oh no, I want to know what happened. And then you can build the anticipation in the current narrator, and then cliffhanger them. Though I think you're right that Holden's chapters cliffhanger a little bit more often than Miller's do. Yeah. And, for something this large, this is a solar system spanning, geopolitical is not the right word, interplanetary political.
You told me there's 9 books, and it definitely felt to me like reading this that they're setting out to write at least 3, we're going big. And we're also, we're going for something that could be like episodic TV too. And I think that's a lot easier to do with third person and multiple point POVs than first person.
Yeah, I think it would be really hard to sustain this as a first person. Yeah. And probably impossible, because how do you get Miller's side of the story?
I will have to say, I'm really enjoying this book. I would be surprised if I get to the end of it and want to read the next one. Partly just because I've been let down by sci-fi and fantasy trilogies so very often, and so often the first book has the virtue of discovering the world and the world building. Yeah. It's sort of the Stevenson thing again of you set up all the chess pieces and then it's actually not all that interesting to watch them fight. So it's possible, but I don't know. The 3-body problem is an exception to this, but in that series, we're going to get to it, the stakes just keep getting bigger and bigger in a way, which is kind of amazing. Whereas this, I don't know, I feel like to me, this feels like perfect for a long-running TV series, and I would probably enjoy it as such, just a sort of like Deep Space Nine, right, where you get to know the characters. There are hour-long plots that sort of solve themselves, but there are also these kind of overarching plots that might take a season or two. These kind of the threats, the Dominion, the Cardassians, and things like that. And this feels like that kind of story as well. But we'll see. I'm not sure that I'm actually really a huge fan of that bigness, but I do think that's what it gets you.
Yeah, and my critique of the first half of this book from that sort of bigness perspective is I wish I could get a slightly clearer handle on the political intrigue. Sometimes I'm what's happening at Phoebe Station? I don't quite there's a few places that are a little sort of quickly drawn, and you pointed out one, this quick exposition kind of summing up. Yeah. And what's unfortunate about that was a quick expositional summing up of something that I think was never really drawn super effectively in the first place. Yeah. Of what is, and we don't, it's a mystery, so we don't, we can't know everything. Part of my brain, my world building brain, I really want to know where Phoebe Station is. I want a map.
Well, there's a map.
Oh, your edition has a map?
Yeah. In the
my edition does not have a map.
Yeah. And Phoebe, let's see. God
damn it.
These are all real places. So I looked all these places up. They're all sort of like planetoids in the belt. Yeah. Oh, there's Phoebe. Phoebe is sort of outside, or Phobos, maybe in Deimos. I don't know if that's the same thing. Unfortunately,
we hear about Deimos pretty early in the second half of what we read, but I'm not going to tip my hand of what happens with Deimos. But so we've had some other experiences of being dropped into a very complicated political situation in the fifth season. Yeah. N.K. Jemisin does a better job of making us comfortable in that world. I think these guys do a pretty darn good job, but that's the aspect that I just want a little more clarity around.
I don't. Yeah, I don't necessarily. Maybe for me, it doesn't manifest as clarity. I prefer the intrigue to the action, and I would kind of rather spend more time with the intrigue than the action. And I find the exposition to be a little bit clumsy and fast, and there's just a lot of ships blowing up and people getting shot at and death squads and then to the point where it does start to feel like you're in Star Wars, right? Like, I mean, how often does a blaster go off in the Star Wars movies? It's like every half hour or so, I mean, the biggest lull in the first one is like, okay, the droids get off, and then pretty soon they're at the bar and the guy's getting his hand chopped off, And life isn't like that, right? Like even with soldiers, life isn't like that. Maybe it's like that in Gaza right now. Maybe it's like that on the Ukrainian front right now. But that, that we have Holden just sort of gallivanting across. And I mean, he stumbles. You said that it's his fault, but like the Martian thing, he gets picked up by the Martian battleship. You'd really expect that to be the last thing. Either he's going to get jailed or nothing else is going to happen. Or spaced. And instead they get attacked. And then, okay, they go to Eros. They have like 3 days. And he's like, let's just go to this other planet to follow up this lead that we've been sent on. As soon as they get there, they get attacked by like commandos, and there's just a lot of that. And I find that, when I was younger, I probably would have really enjoyed that. And at a certain point, I recognize, to me, it just sort of feels like somebody's added like soup thickener into the, somebody's added cornmeal to the stew as opposed to rendering the bones, It's an easy way to thicken the plot without giving it tremendous substance. And not that it's particularly poorly written, like it's well-written action. It's just less to my taste, I'd rather lean into the political thriller part of the story and have the action be an occasional thing, and as opposed to it does. So sometimes it feels like the politics is the afterthought as opposed to the main idea.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with you, and it makes me want to read more John Scalzi, because every time that you've brought up John Scalzi, the feeling I get from your description of his writing is that it's more about like large structures and ideas kind of banging against each other in a way that, like, I'm sure there is action, but it's more about the larger conflicts.
I would say with Scalzi, it's often sort of very character level, and where I find his real strength is sort of dialogue. It can get like his Old Man's Wars series sort of feels a little bit like this too. It is sort of Space Marines and things like that. Although there are a couple really masterful ones, I think, too. But yeah, I would even say that I kind of find Stevenson has a lot of action, but I feel like the ideas and the intrigue lead, and this just it feels a little pulpy to me. I do have a reading I really like.
Give it to me.
This is very short, and this is also kind of similar. This is just a moment I really, really liked. So Muss, the new partner, and Miller are investigating this poor guy, a Martian guy, who's been nailed to the wall with a single charge prospector's spike. And I guess I'll read a long version of this. It always surprised Miller how peaceful dead people looked. However god-awful the circumstances, the slack calm that came at the end looked like sleep. It made him wonder if, when his turn came, he'd actually feel that last relaxation. Surveillance cameras, he said. Been out for 3 days, his new partner said. Kids busted 'em. Octavia Muss was originally from Crimes Against Persons, back before Star Helix split violence up into smaller specialties. From there, she'd been on the rape squad. Then a couple months of Crimes Against Children. If the woman still had a soul, it had been pressed thin enough to see through. Her eyes never registered anything more than mild surprise. We know which kids? Some punks from upstairs, she said, booked, fine, released into the wild. We should round them back up, Miller said. It would be interesting to know whether someone paid them to take out these particular cameras. I'd bet against it. Then whoever did this had to know these cameras were busted. Someone in maintenance? Or a cop? Muss smacked her lips and shrugged. She'd come from 3 generations in the belt. She had family on ships like the one the Scipio had killed. The skin and bone and gristle hanging in front of them were no surprise to her. You dropped a hammer under thrust, it fell to the deck. Your government slaughtered 6 families of ethnic Chinese prospector. Someone pinned you to the living rock of Ceres with a 3-foot titanium alloy spike. Same. It's very Chandler. Yeah. And it's very good.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, like that, I want more of that.
And that's how we meet that character.
That is exactly, yeah. I mean, like Muss, it's such a
rape squad, violence against children. Her soul has been pressed so thin you can see through. I mean, that's like something Marlow would mutter.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're in that same Raymond Chandler-esque, like, the analogies are just sort of like drifting into this just kind of wonderful but very imaginative place. And I wish we got more of Muss. Like, she's great. I don't know if this was in the first half, but did you catch the moment where she doesn't come to work and she leaves a little note for Miller that just says, "I'm on cleanup"? And you're like, oh, she's going to kill the guy that escaped the rape charges. Where she was like, and you're like, oh, that is just such a nice little detail that they drop in there.
I do remember that. Yeah, I don't remember when that was, but
because Miller is like, we can just pop up there and put a bullet in him, and she says something like, yeah, but then it would be on the board and we would have to investigate it. And then as soon as the Star Helix contract gets pulled, she goes and takes the guy out. Yeah, which is just, she's I think we really get a sense of Belters from Muss.
And it's not all good, right? Like there's a familiarity with violence, but I mean, at the same time, she is avenging or finding justice for a horrific crime too. It's not like she's doing it out of cruelty. I mean, these are interesting books because they play, again, another noir theme, which is taking the law into your own hands, and when is it okay to do that? I wonder, I just had a thought. I wonder if between our 2 writers, Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank, I wonder if one of them always writes the Miller sections
I have the answer
and one
to
of them writes the Holden sections. You do?
I do have that answer if you want it.
Does it relate to your trivia or?
It does not.
Well, then I do want it.
But that is where I discovered it. Where I discovered it. They I don't know which is which, but one of them writes the Miller chapters and one of them writes the Holden chapters.
It feels that way. There are some very nice moments. Most of my favorite bits of writing were, in fact, in the Miller chapters. Yeah. So whichever Daniel or Ty, sorry. But there were also some very nice moments. That moment where Holden hears the breathing of his lover over the radio, like right before the ship blows up, is very well done.
And if you're in the writing group and you get the straight man, you know what your job is. Your job is to provide the backdrop.
Well, also maybe he's the space opera guy too, right? Like he's the one who's comfortable with torpedoes and afterburners and the tea kettle drive versus the full burn and the juice that you go into under full acceleration and what's the name of the fastest reactor, like the guy you can still see
the Epstein drive
and you can actually see Epstein's ship with a telescope heading out to.
There's some great line, the longest, most magnificent funeral in human history.
Right.
And you're like, yeah, that is the show dramatizes his discovery of the Epstein drive in a really wonderful way, in a really sort of heartbreaking, but still very well executed manner.
It's a gruesomely sad story. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well,
do you want to go first? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Not long after Holden's crew are taken aboard the Donnager, Shed, the medic, is killed when a Gauss round just blasts through the ship and just takes his head completely off. When they were interviewed about it, the 2 authors gave their reasons for killing off Shed. I'm going to read you 3 reasons, and your job is to pick the one that they articulated. They're okay, we killed Shed because of blank.
Okay.
So option A. They felt that they needed to raise the stakes for Holden's character and drive home the responsibility he feels for his crew. And they figured the best way to do that was to kill one of them before we really got to know all of them. B, the authors thought that other characters might join the crew as the story went along, and they thought that Shed was the easiest character to get rid of since he had less backstory at this point, and he also seemed the most vanilla. They said, like, he kind of seems a little like Holden, and so they were like, we should probably get rid of him there. C, the entire story came from a role-playing game one of the two authors had been running, and the player who played Shed moved away and gave their permission for Shed to be killed. And upon writing the novel, the authors stayed faithful to the plot of their game.
God. C is such, like, that would be such great bait. It also has the ring of truth. But the thing that felt narratively true to me, my own theory going into it, was B. So I'm going to stick with my feeling before you gave me that wonderful scenario and say B.
It's C.
Ah! Damn it.
Ty Frank was running a game for Daniel Abraham and a group of their friends, and the guy who was playing Shed moved away. And they were like, killed him. We got to kill him.
Just like when the actor like gets another job on a TV series. Like,
totally. And I was just like, wait, what? And then I was like, well, this is how Jesse and I write an Eberron novel.
You're never killing Sedge. I don't care.
No. I think it's
even if I move away, you can write a novel with Sedge, but you don't get to kill him.
No, I think the novel is Sedge and Greybeard. I think it's this like wacky buddy story with noirish elements and nightmare horror.
Yeah. How would you? That's intriguing. They're great characters. I think
they are great characters. Yeah.
As is Firth. Well, okay. Here's yours.
We had a double ding last time, so we're probably both on a little bit of a hangover.
I missed the opportunity for That's What She Said. After you said something like, we haven't had a double ding for years, and the correct response to that was, that's what she said, and I did not say that. And oh well, missed opportunities. Okay, so many of the conventions in this book were established in the golden age of sci-fi. Water haulers, I found reference to in some early stories. Belt miners, belt colonies, planetoid colonies. These go back to the 30s and 40s. So which classic sci-fi writer was the first to describe using the terms spinward and anti-spinward to navigate artificial human habitats that were spun to induce gravity through centrifugal force? Understand the question? Basically, totally. Who coined the terms spinward and anti-spinward in this particular context?
Awesome.
A, Isaac Asimov. B, Robert A. Heinlein. C, Olaf Stephenson. Or D, Larry Niven.
Boy, is this the time? Is this the moment that Niven is the right answer? I don't know Olaf Stevenson, so that I just sort of have to recuse myself from that possibility, which will be which points me in the direction of thinking that that's the right answer. Heinlein is, like, out of those four, he's the hardest science writer. Though again, I don't know Stevenson, but and I could really see Heinlein's kind of like brisk prose. Because it's such a great term, spinward, anti-spinward. It's just wonderful. So I'm going to go with Heinlein.
It was D, Larry Niven.
Fuck! This was a long con, Jesse.
It was an amazing con. And
it's like 2 years of red herrings.
2 years of red herrings. He invented those terms in Ringworld.
Of course he did, because that makes perfect sense, and it was just too much sense.
I kind of misdirected you by referring to the golden age of sci-fi, and Niven is more of a silver age writer. But if you listen to my grammar, I never said that it was a Golden Age writer. I only... Asimov apparently has the first story mentioning water haulers, like water freighters, and Heinlein has the first story mentioning a belt colony. And then Olaf Stephenson also has used, I think, both of those conventions at some point, or wrote stories about
I don't know that
Asgard.
writer.
I think I have his name right. I hope I do. Olaf... I might be confusing. Oh, Stapledon. I'm sorry. His name was Olaf Stapledon. Would you have?
No, I still don't know.
Would you have guessed Olaf Stapledon? Because if you
I still would have recused myself.
But I feel like that asterisk is the long con with the Larry Niven. When I realized that, I was like, oh, should I ask it next time? And should I ask you about the water hauler thing this time to kind of prime you for that era, then throw the misdirect? And I was like, no, he'll see it coming if I do that. I gotta use it now.
Jesse, I never see anything coming. It's like the things I see coming are never the important things. It's like I'm looking away from the correct thing, and I'm like, oh, look at that plot over there.
Yeah, I don't disagree. You've been doing really well at trivia lately, though. I know you've been on a tear.
Yeah, I would not have guessed that.
Yeah, well, there was the double ding, and I think there've been a couple times recently where you got it and I did not, but we had a double buzz tonight, so we're sort of right back in the familiar place. Well, everybody, next time is the second half of this book. It'll be really interesting to see what happens. I think. Here's my prediction. Earth is somehow involved, because Earth is like the one major power that would stand to benefit from a conflict between the belt and Mars, and also they've been kind of staying out of it, which is sort of they're kind of conspicuously absent up to this point. So that's my hypothesis, but it also, Leviathan. The other thing, there's something about Leviathan. There are a lot of allusions in this book, and if Leviathan is an allusion to Hobbes, that suggests something about Earth's world government, perhaps, and the corruption there too. Although I could also imagine it being like an Earth corporation or something like that. I do like that the world government is just the United Nations. Like they don't bother to give it another name. They're just like, it's the UN. It got increasingly powerful, and now it's the UN.
Which I think is great. Like, I think that's I think when you're doing sci-fi, I think there's probably an impulse to invent everything. And you probably, that's not the way our world works, even though change is all the time, there are things that continue. Yeah. And I think that was a nice touch, that the UN is sort of still the UN.
This is, would you say 200 years in the future? It's 200 years in the future in a world that is about as familiar as 200 years in the future could possibly be. They've got tablets, they got mobile phones, they got rockets, they got guns, they've got missiles, they got all the stuff we got.
Things haven't really changed except for, like the ability to cross the solar system in weeks instead of years,
right.
Which that's an important convention for your plot. It's a narrative device.
Right.
And, but yeah, you're right. It is a very familiar world. It's not Star Trek.
It is cool. It is cool to imagine the solar system is really big, and a lot of our sci-fi, we're sort of like, oh yeah, solar system, that's like home, boring. Let's go to other planets. Yeah. And it's like, no, it's called The Expanse. There's a whole lot of space between Jupiter and the asteroid belt, and there's a whole lot of space between Jupiter and the other planets, and it is massive. It is an expanse. There's a lot out there. There's plenty to explore. We could spend 1,000 years, building habitats and mining and exploring.
Totally.
And that's fertile ground. But so anyway, next up is the second half of the book.
Nice. Upper Middlebrow is a small point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are the senior detectives. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by me, Chris Bagg. We are supported by Jenny Grieve and Justin Reich.
And a reminder, Chris and I are both writers and editors and can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbag.com and jessedukes.com. Or you can enroll as a patron at the You Really, Really Like Us tier, which includes some one-on-one editorial time with one of us or the other, or both. See you next time.
Thanks for listening, everybody.